Today, we announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The charges allege that Epstein sexually abused young girls by enticing them to engage in sex acts for money.
Well, that is a New York prosecutor laying out new charges against Jeffrey Epstein, one of the world's richest registered sex offenders. Not just rich, well-connected too. The New York billionaire made a lot of friends over the years. American presidents, British royalty, Hollywood celebrities, and journalists, including one of our guests, Jesse Kornbluth, who turned his back on Epstein decades ago. We'll hear from Jesse in a moment, but first, a look at how New York is bringing Epstein to justice.
Today, we announce the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The victims, all underage girls at the time of the alleged conduct, were given hundreds of dollars in cash. As alleged, Epstein also paid certain victims to recruit additional girls to be similarly abused. This allowed Epstein to create an ever-expanding web of new victims.
Billionaire businessman Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in New York Saturday on federal charges related to sex trafficking.
Epstein was arrested when his private jet landed from Paris.
Agents executed a search warrant on his mansion in New York City.
Inside, investigators found hundreds of female nude photographs, some of the photos seeming to show underage girls.
He is now facing up to 45 years in prison on charges that he was running a sex trafficking ring in the early 2000s that included underage girls as young as 14 years old.
Jeffrey Epstein traveled in highly influential and wealthy social circles. He has been tied to former President Bill Clinton, as well as Great Britain's Prince Andrew and even current President Trump.
A tape in the NBC archives of a Mar-a-Lago party shows Trump giving Epstein his personal attention.
I had a falling out with him a long time ago. I don't think I've spoken to him for 15 years. I was not a fan of his.
If you're in his orbit and you were doing things that you shouldn't have back in the early 2000s, you ought to be very, very concerned right now.
This is the second time federal prosecutors have gone after Epstein. Back in 2008, there was outrage after federal prosecutors struck a plea deal.
The agreement allowed Epstein to avoid federal sex abuse charges and a possible life sentence.
According to prosecutors, he is, quote, not reformed, not chastened, he is not repentant.
Well, it is a fascinating case. Let's go through it now with our guests. And up in the top left there, we have Jesse Kornbluth, an award-winning journalist who recently wrote a fascinating article titled, "I Was a Friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Here's What I Know." In the same great city of New York, we have Vinu Varghese, a defense attorney who can help us unpack the legal aspects of this case. And finally, we have Yasmin Vafa, a former attorney who now campaigns against sex trafficking. So let's start with you, Jesse. How did you get to know Jeffrey Epstein back in the day?
We met at a party. He started telling me stories. He knew who I was, and he knew his stories were fascinating. They were stories about him as a bounty hunter. He would help people in America track down money stolen by dictators in Africa, and other times he would help those dictators hide their money. And I thought he would make a great subject, so I started to see him a bit. And then things got strange. He asked me to accompany him to a law firm where he was going to serve a subpoena. We went to this firm and he didn't get past the receptionist. It made no sense to me that someone who did the work he did was doing what a process server would do. And I lost interest in the project, but he did not lose interest in me. The night before I was to marry a woman he had met, a beautiful, talented writer, he called her at our home and suggested that since this was her last night of freedom, she might come over and have sex with him. She thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. And then, as my ex-wife reminds me, something else happens. Very soon after, a man representing himself as me, started calling women asking for a date. Epstein was the caller. He didn't seem to realize he was calling friends of ours who got back to us and said, someone is impersonating you. The question, why would someone impersonate me? This sounds self-referential, but let me be brief. I was a star writer at New York Magazine. I had this fantastically talented, beautiful wife, and the most important thing of all, I was brilliantly educated at Harvard. And it's the Harvard thing that is the key to this particular story. Epstein was obsessed with Harvard. You can see photos with him in Harvard sweatshirts. He gave Harvard a lot of money. He courted Harvard scientists. And in some ways, one of the tragedies of Epstein is he was, a poor kid, didn't graduate from college. He was the little match boy, and he was desperate to be inside the elite. And the way he found to do that was by dealing with the sexual peculiarities of very important rich people and compromising them.
Are you saying, Jesse, that that is his great ladder, if you like, up to the elite, rather than his brilliance as a financier?
There is no proof that Jeffrey invested a single dollar for anybody, maybe Leslie Wexner. But I think the trove of stuff that came out of his townhouse might contain the kinds of material that important people would not like to have publicized. And if Epstein raised money by informing those people that he had that stuff, then they might invest in his funds. That is the theory I find most palatable to explain how Epstein has a single dollar.
Right. Well, you mentioned the raids. Let's go to Yasmin now. Yasmin, the raids, the indictment, all of these things happened at the same time. Let's look at the indictment. Some 14 pages long. Very interesting and shocking details in here. 2 counts. This is the most important thing. Conspiracy to commit sex trafficking and sex trafficking. Now, for the layman watching, what do those terms mean?
So these are federal charges that are brought under a federal anti-trafficking law that we have in the United States called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. They're very serious charges. It basically alleges that Epstein engaged in some type of activity, including recruiting, obtaining, maintaining, soliciting individuals under the age of 18 for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And the charges that are specifically alleged here carry a 10-year minimum. So very, very serious charges, and then also adding in the conspiracy charges.
Yes, I mean, a lot of people will look at these sort of euphemisms, sex trafficking, conspiracy to commit sex trafficking, and wonder why, given that mentioned in the indictment that he's been allegedly abusing, children at the age of 14, the youngest ones, why he is not being prosecuted for alleged, say, sex abuse of children.
So because these are federal charges, those are typically in the United States, those would be considered state-level charges, rape, child endangerment, sexual abuse of a minor. But in fact, these sex trafficking charges basically encompass that behavior. They imply that there was illicit conduct with young children under the age of 18. In this case, the victims are alleged to be between 14 and 18, which could carry a 10-year minimum in this case.
Vinu, when you look at the indictment, 14 pages, got it in my hand here, how strong is the prosecution's case?
Look, based on the indictment, I'm not sure how strong it is at all, because you're talking about charges that go back, or alleged activities that go back to 2005. Now, some of these are the same activities, it appears, that were covered under the Florida agreement. So his lawyers have a bunch of different potential avenues to explore, one of which is the fact that there was this agreement signed in Florida that, per the agreement, only binds the Florida Federal Prosecutor's Office. But that's something that's going to be explored here in New York by his lawyers to try to get this indictment kicked. What's missing in this indictment is what I see is sex trafficking. It looks like he's got homes in Florida and in New York and it doesn't appear, well, it appears that these are local girls in both places. Now, he's not charged with a violation of the Mann Act, which would bringing girls in from different parts. But, you know, it begs to question of whether these are actual federal charges.
Yasmin, come in.
The federal government is jumping in on state charges, because it looks like he's engaged in underage sex in New York and Florida, and these acts would likely be time barred.
So it seems from all the facts and evidence that's come forward that he certainly recruited, obtained, maintained individuals under the age of 18 for the purposes of a commercial sex act. Under the federal law, a commercial sex act is defined incredibly broadly. It's defined as any sex act in exchange for anything of value. And so I actually think that these are appropriate charges.
Yasmin, thank you. We're going to come back to the legal aspect of it in a moment in New York. But first, you know, as we heard, this is the second time prosecutors have gone after Epstein. Just over a decade ago, he was convicted of soliciting prostitution from underage girls. He was actually facing a much more serious charge, but they went away thanks to a deal struck by his very expensive legal team. In 2007, the Miami prosecutor Alexander Acosta had a 53-page indictment ready for federal court. It contained charges which, had they been proved, could have put Epstein away for life. But at the time, the young prosecutor, still in his 30s and eyeing up a career in DC, faced a formidable opposition. Epstein's 8-man strong defense team was an all-star lineup, including Alan Dershowitz, famous for defending O.J. Simpson, Ken Starr, a special prosecutor in Bill Clinton's impeachment proceedings, and Jay Lefkowitz, a DC power broker and former law firm colleague of Acosta's. Acosta was later quoted as saying he felt incapable of going up against those 8 powerful attorneys. He felt his career was at stake. And in October 2007, Acosta met Lefkowitz over breakfast in West Palm Beach, where it's reported a deal was struck, something that Acosta firmly denies.
The meeting that was alleged was a breakfast meeting that took place after the agreement was negotiated, not before.
Either way, Epstein would plead guilty to 2 prostitution charges in state court. He had to register as a sex offender for life and pay compensation to his dozens of accusers. And in return, Epstein and his accomplices would receive immunity from all federal charges. He was sentenced to just 18 months in a county jail, not a federal prison, and only served 13. He was also allowed out 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, to work from his Palm Beach office.
The expectation was that it would be an 18-month sentence, and the expectation was that it would be served in jail. And so this work release was complete BS.
No wonder it was dubbed the deal of the century. And that deal went on to haunt Alex Acosta, who went on to work in President Trump's cabinet, has since resigned because of pressure from the Democrats and the media. Before he resigned, though, he totally refuted that he'd given Epstein a soft deal.
The Palm Beach State Attorney's Office was ready to let Epstein walk free. No jail time, nothing. Without the work of our prosecutors, Epstein would have gotten away with just that state charge. We did what we did because we wanted to see Epstein go to jail.
Well, we will speak to our guest lawyers in a moment, but first let's hear from a friend of Alex Acosta who describes the pressure he came under while negotiating the Epstein deal.
He pointed fingers, not only again at the state attorney, but he also said we, meaning the prosecution team, were, quote, assaulted by the defense team in a way that they had never, ever been, quote, assaulted, which basically meant that 2 of his team members, I believe, during the investigation, were followed. They were investigated personally. And, you know, the behavior of a defense attorney toward the prosecution was very unusual.
Well, that was Conchita Sarnoff, an expert in sex trafficking and author of a book on the Epstein case called Traffic King. Yasmin, is that the best, really, that Acosta could have got at the time?
I mean, I think it's universally believed that this was an incredibly lenient deal, that it's not common at all. It's something that I've certainly never seen in the course of my career around issues that are serious as these crimes have alleged to be. I find that very, very difficult to believe. And frankly, I think it sends a really terrible message to victims and survivors out there that if the people who are abusing you are powerful enough that you can just forget about achieving any sort of justice.
Look, I watched Acosta's press conference, and I'll say this as a former prosecutor, what he said had the ring of truth. Look, people can jump on the bandwagon now, and Miami Herald can do its reporting, which says that this was a terrible deal, very lenient deal. But the reality is no one has except for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Florida and the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York now, and his lawyers at the time, nobody knows what the actual evidence is. It hasn't been released to the public. And these cases are very difficult to prove. And it appeared that they felt this was the best way to go. Just because there was a 53-page federal indictment draft, and the key word is draft, doesn't mean that that's provable beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. And what prosecutors want more than anything is to win. They don't want to take a loss. And if they felt they weren't going to win, well, then they did something which actually was extraordinary, which was force the state prosecutors to push for a more harsher sentence, which included sexual offender registration. And when you talk about what message this sends to victims, remember, all we know right now is that there is one victim in this case, and that's the one that Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to, or involving that person. Everyone else is a complainant. That's the term in the criminal justice system. Everyone else is an alleged victim.
The sheriff of Broward County, when the Miami Herald called him, said, "I'm totally defeated. There's no point talking to you. This will never go anywhere. We had the evidence." A lower person
He's a cop.
in the
That's
U.S.
what cops
Attorney's
say.
Office in South Florida said, "We had what we needed. We could have gone forward." The thing to remember about Acosta is he was a graduate of a law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, which also had Dershowitz and Ken Starr on staff. You bet he was overwhelmed. He would have ignored almost any evidence in order to arrive at the decision he made.
I think that that's way too broad a statement at this point, or it's an unsubstantiated statement.
Let's talk about why now. New York has picked this up where seemingly in many people's eyes, Florida failed. Jesse, why now?
You have to remember, Epstein was arrested, and then there was the raid. That would have been a very bold thing if they had arrested him and the raid produced nothing. But the raid produced just a treasure trove of potential evidence. I have to think that behind this whole event is an insider, an employee, a friend who blew the whistle and gave prosecutors the hint that it was worth doing this.
Did he?
Look, I think to understand that question, you got to understand how the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York operates. They see themselves, the Southern District of New York, sees themselves as the sovereign district of the United States, that they are the preeminent United States Attorney's Office. So this, again, to me, probably more likely speaks to the fact that they are who they are and they think that they can react to things and that somebody else got it wrong. But it'll remain to be seen where this case goes and how it goes. In terms of a treasure trove, we don't know yet. I mean, we know that there are pictures of nude women. He hasn't been charged with child pornography, possession of those charges. We'll see. If those come, then that's going to pile on.
Yasmin, let me come to you for a moment. Why do you think this has resurfaced in New York over a decade later?
So certainly we're dealing with a different cultural moment. I think, we're on the heels of the Me Too movement, realizing the seriousness and pervasiveness of sexual violence against young women and girls across the United States. And I think that's really created a culture of accountability. And I think it was a big reason why the original reporter, Julie Brown, in this case, went back and revisited the facts surrounding the plea agreement back in 2008 and really looking at how it was that given the sheer amount of evidence that has been alleged to have been collected throughout the years on this individual, we saw such a lenient plea agreement.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's move on. Well, drawn into this story are two American presidents. Bill Clinton's name appears in the flight log of Jeffrey Epstein's private jet 26 times. One alleged victim even claimed to have spotted the former leader on Epstein's private island in the Caribbean. But in a recent statement, Clinton says he knows nothing of the terrible crimes, that he only took a total of 4 trips on Epstein's plane, and he also denies ever visiting the island. Let's move on to Trump now, the current president, who's associated with Epstein years ago when he was simply a New York real estate billionaire. Well, back in 2002, Trump described Epstein as a terrific guy who likes beautiful women as much as I do, and observed many of them are on the younger side. But Trump is known to have fallen out with Epstein 12 or 15 years ago.
I was not a fan of Jeffrey Epstein, and you watched people yesterday saying that I threw him out of a club. I didn't want anything to do with him. That was many, many years ago. It shows you one thing, that I have good taste, okay? Now, other people, they went all over with him. They went to his island. They went all over the place. He was very well known in Palm Beach. His island, whatever his island was, wherever it is, I was never there. Find out the people that went to the island.
Back up to Jesse for a moment. Jesse, neither of the former president nor the current president have had any criminal charges laid or allegations made against them. But in terms of optics, how on earth was a man like Epstein able to hang around with people like this for so long?
Well, that is the purpose of the sweetheart deal, because it didn't look as if he'd done very much. When he returned to New York, he was instantly rehabilitated in social circles. There was a post-Yom Kippur dinner at his house. Katie Couric, George Stephanopoulos. Some of these people brought their children. They brought their children to the house of a man who had abused children. And now they feel fooled and compromised, and they're full of regret. But this is just the tip of that iceberg. It was always the plan for Jeffrey to be treated as if he had done very little.
You know, the two presidents and others are clear that they stopped associating with Epstein either before or after he was convicted of sex offences, but many others, including Hollywood figures and the UK's Prince Andrew, continued to associate with him after he was convicted. Here are the two of them walking in New York's Central Park in late 2010. And then there is this picture from 2001 of Prince Andrew with his arm around Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who says she was forced to have sex with the prince when she was a teenager.
It started with one, and then it trickled into two, and then so on and so forth. And, you know, before you know it, I'm being lent out to politicians and to academics and to people that royalty.
Roberts claimed in an affidavit the two of the men that Epstein lent her out to were attorney Alan Dershowitz and Prince Andrew, the Duke of York. Dershowitz and Prince Andrew have both denied any involvement with Roberts.
Let's go back to Yasmin now. Yasmin, as we close out the show here, why is it that the wealthy, rich, famous, older white men, it seems, predominantly in this case, are willing to risk their reputations to spend time with this man?
You know, I think a lot of it has to do with what Jesse said. You know, he was welcomed back into society. The way in which his behavior and his alleged crimes, you know, from all of the evidence that we've now been able to see have been minimized, allowed him to really be welcomed back with open arms. And, you know, I will say that, you know, these are very typical profiles of the men that we see abusing young women and girls in our work every day. They are overwhelmingly white, wealthy men of means who deliberately target vulnerable young women and girls for sex. And so, you know, I think realizing that there was this sense of invincibility in the midst of a deep culture of impunity for men who behave in this manner in our country and elsewhere, I think made them feel incredibly safe to continue cavorting with Epstein.
And the expectation is this case... Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
Your question has built on a wrong assumption. These men risked nothing, certainly not their reputations. They were the beneficiaries of a patrimony which has gone back forever. They fully anticipated nothing would ever happen to them. And these are stupid people because in the wisdom of my ancestors, wenn der Kleine steht, hat man Sechel und Tuckes. When the little one stands up, your brain's in your ass. These guys behaved any way they wanted because women were a subspecies, had no voice, and could never come back to hurt them. That turns out to be incorrect.
And this case is expected to yield a great deal of information about a great deal of people. Jesse, thank you very much for your contribution to the Nexus. Yasmin and Vinu, thank you also. And thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. But for now, goodbye and see you next week.